You can't think your way out of the traumatic experience. You have to create a new embodied pattern for that. What does that mean? You have to give yourself new evidence. You have to give your body new evidence that when I touch that hot stove or that object that appears hot, that I'm not always going to get burnt. Triggers, trauma collisions. What the heck are we talking about when I say I'm triggered by you? What does that mean and why does that happen for us even if we don't have the language for it? That's what I'm here to talk about today, because nowadays, whether we know it's happening and we have the language behind it or not, we are constantly triggering and being triggered by people. That's just the nature of life. So let's define a couple things first. What is a trigger? For me, a trigger is a moment, an event, could be a word, could be something I witnessed, could be a sound, a smell, anything stimulating that evokes a response from me that is sudden and that is unconscious. A sudden, unconscious response to something that happens outside of myself. So it could be anything. It could be a word that somebody says. It could be the screeching of car tires. I might get triggered by the smell of a perfume that reminds me of an ex-girlfriend from high school. Or I could be triggered by something somebody says to me that reminds me of a relationship I had with one of my parents. Either way, these triggers are all out there in the world just waiting for us to encounter them. Now, what is a trauma, right? Okay, so we've talked about trauma a number of times in the podcast here before, but to me, a traumatic event is simply an event that leaves a memorable impression on our unconscious and our conscious bodies. So a trauma is a significant event that creates a memory to help you survive an event like that in the future. The best way of thinking about this is when a child reaches and touches a hot object for the first time and gets burnt. That's technically a traumatic event, and it creates a memory, an impression on that individual so that when they encounter a hot object again, they're remembered, ooh, last time I touched that, I got burnt, so that we don't do that again. So, for example, if we were traumatized in a relationship we had with an ex-partner where they said something belittling or diminishing, something that made us feel less than, maybe they called us a pussy or a wimp. And then fast forward to another relationship where a partner says something that we interpret to be the same thing, even if it's not, it's going to elicit a response from us that is unconscious, a protective defense response. So just think about triggers now, right? Think about how this happens and where this happens in your life. Where do you get triggered by people, by sounds, by events, by beliefs, by religions? Sometimes religions can be triggering to us because of the way that I was raised or what I was raised around, and trying to distance myself from those beliefs created this whole pattern and response. Anyway, if you guys are following me up to this point, then you're probably like, yeah, I get it. I know what trauma is. I know what my triggers are. Awesome. What I want to talk about are trauma collisions, because for me, this is going to describe exactly what our responsibility is, what my responsibility is around my traumas, and how I can better navigate the world being aware of other people's traumas and triggers. So here's a real life example. I have a client of mine who, in conversation with him, he was revealing an example of an opportunity where he got really triggered and he could connect it back to a trauma that he had earlier in his life. And in coaching him to confront this trauma, he approached the person who produced the trigger for him, and it evoked a similar mirrored trauma response from this other person. And he was able to recognize it in the moment. And as we were debriefing, I came up with this idea of a trauma collision where his traumas and confronting it and facing off with it evoked a response from somebody else involved with this who triggered their trauma response. And then they were both competing for survival with each other. And because he was able to recognize it, he was able to navigate it and come from more of a soft and compassionate approach. And what it led to, and this is the important point, is greater understanding and greater healing and communication for both of them. Now, that's the best case scenario. That's the best possible outcome, is everyone involved learns more about themselves and creates greater possibilities for communication and collaboration with each other. That's what we're all hoping for. What happens more often than not is, especially when we're unaware of our traumas and our triggers, we just evoke and elicit all of these traumatic responses from each other. This person gets triggered and they invoke and trigger another response in somebody else involved, and it ping-pongs around with no actual resolution. So what do? This is where my responsibility of knowing my traumas, going down deeper into the depths of where does this come from for me? When a female speaks to me with this particular tone, what is that reminding me of? And why does that trigger a response that I need to defend myself? When I hear the screeching of car brakes, why does that make my palms sweaty? What is that connected to? Where did that happen in my history? And what is my body informing me of in that moment? The first thing is to become aware of those things, to create a greater relationship with the traumatic experiences we've had in our past. And I'll put the disclaimer right here. Some traumatic work can be really, really difficult to navigate. And it's really important to navigate that under the guise and supervision of somebody who's trained in trauma release work. So I recommend you do that. And if you don't know where to go, you can reach out to us and we can help you with that. But nonetheless, creating a greater awareness of your traumatic patterns, your trigger responses, is going to empower you to identify them and then to navigate it more effectively in all of your relationships. That's what we're all out to do. To be able to be like my client who I was coaching, who recognized the trigger in somebody else in working to resolve his own, and then accessing a deeper place of communication and collaboration. And now that relationship got a boost. At first, it was uncomfortable. At first, there were triggers that wanted to ping pong and bounce off of each other. But because there was one person in the room who had the awareness to say, whoa, triggers are happening. Let's speak more openly about what this is. Let's disarm the conversation for a minute and get more real. When we can do that effectively, then we can really access greater healing for everyone involved, which ultimately that's the work that we're trying to do. Because otherwise, the alternative is we're out in the world and my traumas are crashing into yours and producing a response. And then you're reacting to that and that's producing a response in me, maybe looping somebody else into the conversation. And before we know it, all we're doing is bouncing around these traumas and reliving them instead of resolving them. Your responsibility, just like mine, is to become aware of and identify my own trauma patterns and my trauma responses, the triggers that elicit that and evoke that in me. That's my work. That's your work. And then to be able to identify those in the moment that it's happening, and then to have the courage to speak openly about where that comes from. That's leadership. That's mastery of self. And that's also resolving traumatic patterns so that we can create new possibilities in our lives. Now, I know that that's a lot of logic, right? There's a lot of stuff to think through. And anybody out there who's worth their weight in this type of work will tell you that a lot of trauma work needs to be done in resolving that in the body. You can't think your way out of the traumatic experience. You have to create a new embodied pattern for that. What does that mean? You have to give yourself new evidence. You have to give your body new evidence that when I touch that hot stove or that object that appears hot, that I'm not always going to get burnt. That when I get vulnerable and I share my fears with people openly in public, that I'm not going to be ridiculed, bullied, or beat down for that. We have to have the courage to step forward and give ourselves a new experience, new evidence for our body, for my ego to interpret. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep reliving the same survival pattern every time the opportunity arises. So just the awareness of knowing that everywhere in our lives, my triggers are colliding with your triggers and your triggers are colliding with somebody else's triggers in this intricate trauma ping pong, that all it takes is one person to step in the middle and grab the ball and say, hey, let's look at this for a minute. Here's what's happening for me. This is connected to this part of my past. It's really uncomfortable for me to share this with you, but I recognize that this evokes this type of response in me, and I want to take responsibility for that and invite you to see where this might be triggering and evoking that response in you. High level stuff here. Right? This is not entry level personal development stuff. This is the type of work that can take years to get to, and it has for me. I know it has for a lot of people. This isn't something that you just listen to one podcast episode and boom, you're a trauma expert. I'm just trying to give you the understanding of how this works and how this occurs in our interpersonal relationships on a day-to-day basis so that we can create greater awareness around this and start to navigate it in our lives differently. So I hope that gives you a different perspective. And now you walk out in the world and you look at these relationship dynamics you have and you start to say, oh, that's what he was talking about. I see the triggers. I see where we're bouncing off of each other. Maybe take this context and concept and look at how this happens in your family dynamic. That's the most rich and abundant territory to look at triggers and how they bounce off of each other. A lot of traumas are shared within families or close-knit groups, people that have had long-term relationships with you. So take this information here today and apply it to some of your social networks that you have, your family, your friends, your work community, maybe your workout community, whatever it is, and see where those triggers might be bouncing off of each other with curiosity. To look at it as a researcher, right? Put on your put on your lab coat for a second and just approach it with curiosity and say, that's interesting. Where's that coming from? And if you have the courage, invite somebody else to look at it through the same lens that you're choosing to look at it through. That's how we all grow together. So bring some people along for the journey with you. If you need to, share this episode with them. Let them listen to this first, and then take a more curious look at how things are happening in your social groups. All right, y'all. Tune in for next week's Monday morning meditation. I love you. Many blessings. Peace out.